All right, we're going to get started in about a minute as people are coming in. Welcome. Thanks for joining us. All right. I'd like to welcome everyone today. Good afternoon. Thanks for joining us on a late Tuesday afternoon. I'm Stacy Young, and I head up the Preservation Compact, which is a policy collaborative to preserve affordable rental housing. We bring together lots of different partners, all levels of government, for-profit and nonprofit owners, and community groups to come up with programs, policies, and strategies to preserve affordable rental housing. We're located at Community Investment Corporation, or CIC, which is a nonprofit lender that has been financing naturally occurring affordable housing for 35 years, way before anyone started talking about NOAA. Our borrowers at CIC are mostly small for-profit owners, but you'll hear more about CIC in a few minutes. So welcome to our webinar, Preserving Owners to Preserve NOAA. We're thrilled to have nearly 200 people registered today. We've got people from around the country: Florida, North Carolina, New York, DC, Pennsylvania, Colorado, Minnesota, Texas, Oregon, Rhode Island, Massachusetts, and of course, California. I'm guessing most of you are here because you already know how important NOAA, naturally occurring affordable housing, is and how important it is to preserve. Many of us have heard the statistic that about 70% of low cost rental units are unsubsidized. In fact, a number of good articles about NOAA are out there. McKinsey published a recent piece, as well as the Urban Institute has a number of pieces, some on that really small stock we're going to talk about later, and the 2 to 4 stock. Here in Chicago, we just finished up a series of meetings about NOAA as part of the Preservation Lab. The Preservation Lab is a partnership between DePaul's Institute for Housing Studies and the Preservation Compact. As part of this NOAA lab, DePaul documented how vulnerable different NOAA properties are. For instance, in the last 7 years, Chicago has lost 10% of its affordable housing stock, different types of NOAA in different markets for different reasons. For instance, 46% of 2 to 4 unit buildings have been associated with a foreclosure filing since 2005, and 29% of multifamily buildings have seen foreclosure filings over the same period. And those foreclosures are typically happening in lower cost markets. At the same time, in higher cost areas, many 2 to 4 unit buildings are lost as they're converted to single family homes, and affordable units and multifamily buildings are lost in those higher cost markets as values and rents increase. So that was a lot. That description helps illustrate different ways that NOAA is threatened. But what I just said also helps illustrate that NOAA is not a monolithic phenomenon. NOAA is in multifamily buildings and 2 to 4 unit buildings, all the buildings in between. It's in high cost markets and lower cost markets. On the coasts, for instance, in a high cost market, when someone says NOAA preservation, they might be referring to an apartment building in a market with rising values, and preservation means preserving affordable rents as NOAA. Here in Chicago, NOAA preservation might be referring to rental buildings in historically disinvested markets with stagnant values, and preservation means providing local owners access to credit so they can keep buildings in good condition. In our lab discussions, we want to break all of that down to identify different types of NOAA stock, different types of owners, and different types of markets, and if challenges and preservation strategies might vary for all those different aspects of NOAA. Today in our webinar, we'll explore that theme by hearing about different NOAA preservation strategies from different cities. We'll start with the new effort in Los Angeles, how they define the challenge around a particular type of building owner and a particular type of NOAA building, and developed a strategy. Then we'll hear about what's happening in Chicago to tackle NOAA in different markets. And then, perhaps most importantly, we'll hear from a NOAA owner in Chicago, how he thinks about his work and some of his challenges. But before we get started, let me do some very brief introductions of our panelists today. If you want to find out more about the panelists, we have much more extensive bios at a link that is posted or will be posted soon. So Ruby Valaria is the director of the Housing Affordability Program at the Chan Zuckerberg Initiative. Ruby has also worked in developing multifamily mixed income projects and at the housing department in Johannesburg, South Africa. Brian Essenberg is the managing deputy commissioner at the City of Chicago Department of Housing. Brian began his affordable housing career at Neighborhood Housing Services Redevelopment Corporation. Commissioner Marisa Novara couldn't make it today, and so Brian, who has been working on NOAA for a very long time, is pinch hitting. Jack Markowski is president of Community Investment Corporation, or CIC, and before that, he was commissioner of the Chicago Department of Housing for nearly 10 years. And Stephen Rich is the co-founder of the Blue Whale Collective and operates 150 units of affordable rental housing in the city of Chicago. So first off, we're going to hear from Ruby, who's going to present about the new Local Renter Owners Collaborative, or LROC, in the city of Los Angeles. Ruby, take it away.
Hi, folks. Thank you so much, Stacy, and thank you so much for having me here. Just as a really quick CZI, our housing work, we believe everyone deserves a safe, stable, and affordable place to call home. And our work is really anchored in what we call the 3 Ps. We need to produce more housing at all income levels, protect tenants and people, and preserve existing housing. And that only when we have this kind of all of the above approach can we rebuild our housing system and dismantle those systemic inequities. And so the LROC program, the Local Renter Owner Collaborative, is a preservation strategy that's rooted in this kind of equity approach. So you can go to the next slide. So the problem statement, kind of why this, Stacy did some great grounding in why NOAA is important. But in particular, as we started to see the impacts of COVID on renters, which were well understood, and kind of this growing emergency and urgency around an eviction crisis, right, which is still looming. The other side of that coin is that the lack of rental payments putting pressure on these small owners who are already on razor thin margins, particularly smaller owners who own, under 20 units. The pressure can put the building either into distress and create a buying opportunity for Wall Street investors, right, who want to move the building up market in higher cost markets, or fall into disrepair. Either way, kind of tenants losing. This was also problematic for us in terms of kind of the why this, and thinking about NOAA in particular, is that it's the most common form of below market housing, generally affordable to that 80% AMI. So the loss of this stock hurts low wage workers, especially, and the concentration of lower income and minority owners within this housing stock also represents a potential loss of wealth, building opportunities, and a way to kind of move up the economic ladder. Next slide. So we've already begun to see some more coverage of this issue. And really, if the Great Recession is any indicator or guide, we're likely to see an increase of opportunistic private capital seeking to acquire these distressed assets and create a potentially new asset class similar to what we saw in 2006. Next slide. So what are we doing? What is the intervention? Our belief is that keeping these assets in the hands of mom and pop owners and centering racial equity by prioritizing Black, Indigenous, and people of color owners will increase their wealth building opportunity and economic stability, ensuring a supply of affordable housing that doesn't require a deep subsidy and leads to greater community stability. So to achieve that, we did an extensive amount of research, kind of both talking to experts and owners themselves, academics, learning from other existing programs too. And one of the things that really came up time and time again is this idea of high operating costs and low efficiencies due to their size. And so what we want to do is offer a rental relief and deferred maintenance fund to, first of all, in the short term, help stabilize the owners and their tenants, right? We can't even talk about kind of future growth when folks are on the verge of distress and potential foreclosure. So it's really keeping people housed, stabilizing BIPOC small owners to prevent foreclosure and predatory acquisitions and the loss of this Black and brown wealth in the short term. In the medium term, it's, once we've kind of stabilized and identified a cohort through this rental relief fund, work with them to address the pressures that these owners face even without COVID, which are high operating costs, leaving thin margins for them to grow on, and also more vulnerable to speculation in general. And again, this is, in a California high market. In other parts of California, like the Central Valley, you have more of the deterioration and lack of credit as a big issue. And what we do know too is that we believe that a coalition model can help achieve the economies of scale to unlock operational efficiencies that larger institutional owners already have, right? Including property management, group insurance, lower contracting fees, better access to capital, including mortgage rates, and that we can actually quantify, right, this value capture and increase NOI without dramatically raising rents. In our early analysis in the LA market, we saw some data that indicates that small owners pay 20% more in OpEx than their corporate landlords, than larger corporate landlords, I should say. Furthermore, building this network can help fill data gaps, create greater visibility and access for policymakers to target efforts, including capital improvement subsidies, energy retrofits, retrofit programs, housing voucher programs as well. And despite this being the most common source of affordable housing in the US, housing mostly low-income workers, there's a lot of data gaps, both in this stock and the owner. So we're hoping this also can help shed light. And then in the long term, once we kind of can prove that this coalition model works to add value, it's about scalability. And a bit of a value shift, frankly, right? If we can prove that there's a willingness within this slice of owners and have the data proof points on the monetary gains and increased habitability and kind of quality of life for tenants, then we're hoping this process can be easily scaled across the country. This is partly a coalition of the willing, right? So the owners need to see themselves as housing providers and stewards of the community, which we actually saw a lot from focus groups and already exists as a mentality today. So we're hoping this effort can help identify and magnify those owners and kind of build trust. Next slide. So again, just like a little bit of detail specifically in LA and kind of why LA, we actually built a parcel tool to help identify where the NOAA assets are of this stock. Again, we're kind of looking at the under 20 units. And in LA in particular, it was really interesting. We found that NOAA accounts for 80% of all affordable housing units in the region, which is 5 times more the supply than subsidized affordable housing. 62% of the NOAA supply is located in zip codes where more than half the residents are people of color, which means NOAA renters are predominantly low-income people of color too. So thinking about this both from an owner perspective and a tenant perspective. Individual landlords own 76% of all NOAA properties in LA. And a large portion of these buildings are rent control because they're built before 1978. So preserving them is also a way to preserve the rent control stock. Next slide. We looked at a few different intervention potentials in terms of how we can best help. And we analyzed this basically looking at scale, cost, speed to help evaluate this. And there are groups, for example, that are focusing on acquisition of some of these assets, which I think is great and still much needed in the space. But that kind of ignores the wealth building component side for the owners, and also just takes a lot of capital and capacity, right? Even if you had all that money to acquire all these potential properties, who's going to run and own them? So it felt like the best way to meet the moment was really focusing on this kind of coalition approach. Next slide. And to preserve that existing ownership. Just some more data on kind of why operation and maintenance, why NOAA. One thing that was interesting too in the LA context, because again, we were kind of layering in COVID data as well, 40% of Black and brown workers were at risk of displacement in the area based on different data sets. So we believe that this approach will maximize impact for both BIPOC owners and tenants that prevents displacement as well as this kind of longer term wealth creation. Next slide. So these are, our design principles. We design these with these kind of main 5 principles in mind, which a large focus is on collaboration and partnership and community engagement, which if we go to the next slide, you'll actually see who we've partnered with in this. We partnered with Avail, who is a tech platform. They are a property management service. So part of the offerings for the owners is to get free DIY property management services. They help with a range of different issues. The other really key thing about them is that their goal is to really provide a seamless sign-up process and intake for the folks in the program, so that they'll actually manage the rent arrears, the rent relief payments, in collaboration with CRCD, the Coalition for Responsible Community Development, which is a local CDC that has deep ties in South LA, which is the geography that we're focusing in LA. And then Enterprise, who's the fund manager. So we are doing a $5 million fund, which in the next slide, it gets into a little bit more details of what that fund looks like. Oh, not yet, sorry, this is sources of insight. So we talked to a lot of people, like I said, you can keep going. The folks, again, there are no new ideas, I realized, just ones that continue to grow and benefit and recycle off of each other. So we learned a lot from talking to a lot of different people, Stacy included. Next slide. And then this is just more people. Oh, one thing that I do want to just highlight on this is that we did do focus groups with owners, right? And so the focus groups were really interesting in terms of what to focus on and build in, right? So one of the three key findings from that focus groups were the owners did not trust or know how to navigate government assistance, including the CARES Act specific relief dollars a moment for now. They didn't feel like it was for them either. They did not feel heard or supported by existing trade organizations. Again, we're focusing on the slice of owners that own under 20 units. And they were drawn really to the idea of a coalition and a collaborative, a space to just even talk about pain points with each other. Next slide. So the objectives of the pilot, phase 1 is really about stabilizing the owner, as we discussed, and then phase 2 is really about that wealth retention. And phase 2 really is about standardization, right? Is how do we, once we kind of prove that this works, what are those offerings, and then how do we grow from there? Next slide. So the program fund now overall, it's $5 million, like I had mentioned. It's in South LA, and in the following slides, I have some more demographic information about South LA. 2 to 20 units. We are prioritizing 2 to 5 units, meaning owners who own between 2 and 5 units. And again, part of that is because from what the data that we do have suggests is that BIPOC owners tend to be concentrated in the 2 to 5 ownership range. We're prioritizing also owners who have a mortgage, potentially being the most at risk of distress. With this funding size and the geography, we expect to serve up to 280 households, which would translate to 30 to 40 owners. Of that, we think that we need at least 25 units in order to get to that economies of scale, to start to unlock certain efficiencies like that kind of group insurance, other things. Financial technical assistance is going to be offered also to all of the owners to help them understand where they're maybe overpaying for certain things, or can cut costs in a more efficient way. The owner does have to give up to 20% of the arrears rent. So the way it works is that up from March until now, we'll cover back rent. We'll cover up to 80% of back rent. And then the 20%, the owner either has to forgive, or they're still eligible for other state programs, so they could make themselves whole through that. But the idea here is that we wanted to make sure that we're in line with state programs, so that we're not kind of competing for funds either. And that this program is a 12-month program. So in addition to this arrears, we are prioritizing owners who on the intake form say that they want to be in a coalition together. And actually come to, we're going to have monthly, CRCD is going to hold monthly meetings. I mean, it's a lot of it actually is based on some of the great work CIC has done in Chicago. Next slide. And then here's some key characteristics of the neighborhood that we picked, right? So 77% of the units of the buildings in this geographic area are between 5 and 9 units, which is great. 95% are considered NOAA under the definition that we've used. 91% speak Spanish at home, or sorry, 88% speak Spanish at home, 91% of the community is Latinx. So it's a very, just the sample size of it, we're hoping will be great in terms of, again, replicability across the country. Next slide. And then here's some just some more detail about the tech tool, right? So this is, if you're an owner, you would go to the Avail website, you'd fill out the intake form, and you'd do everything online. CRCD, we heard some things from folks about like the digital divide and what happens if people, don't have access to this. That's part of what CRCD is going to be focused on doing, and why, as a community partner, they're going to be so crucial and kind of bridging that divide and helping that gap. But it's one thing that we'll keep an eye out for, and see if that is a reason for folks not signing up. Next slide. I think that's it.
Great. Thank you so much, Ruby. That was information packed. Really, really great preservation presentation. How's that? And so I'm going to get into a discussion with all the panelists. I'm going to start with Ruby, but just for our participants today, if you have questions, please feel free to put them in the Q&A. We'll answer them if we can while we're discussing, but we're also going to try to leave some time at the end to answer some of your questions live. So feel free to start putting questions into the Q&A. And we might go past the hour if we're sort of rolling on some good discussion here, just so you can plan your time. But I'm going to start with a follow-up question for Ruby. In our preservation NOAA lab, DePaul found that in moderate and higher cost markets, just around half the NOAA stock was owned by the same owner for 20 years, the past 20 years. And when those buildings change hands, the prices are too high to maintain the affordable rents. Because again, those are in those sort of moderate and higher cost markets. So everything you described here is really interesting. Your work to keep NOAA owners stable is a great approach to counter the dynamic I just described. For a lot of our discussion today, we're going to talk about different kinds of NOAA owners and different kinds of neighborhoods where NOAA is located. So you just really, you gave a great description of the types of owners you're focusing on, keeping those owners stable. But tell us again, the wealth creation element is really interesting. It's sort of like you're able to accomplish a lot of objectives by focusing on these owners. So can you talk a little bit about the owners that you're focusing on and that particular neighborhood?
Yeah, absolutely. So, we are thinking about generational wealth building too, right? And home ownership, as well as ownership for rentals, have been a way historically in this country. Folks have been able to accumulate generational wealth, as well as even just their own, growing the economic mobility in their lifetime. And it's an opportunity that's been historically denied too, right, to people of color to this day. And so I think it's extremely important that we're kind of rooted in the history of racism in this country around housing, and the opportunities that provides. But it was interesting to me, even in the focus groups and stuff that we're doing, the bifurcation of small or independent white owners versus independent Black and brown owners. And we did an African American group, Latinx group, and an Asian group as well. And just even their awareness of what things were out in the market for them, right, in order to help increase, how to improve the efficiency of their building, increase their NOI, like all of that stuff. So I think that to me was kind of a red flag around, oh, wow, if part of the battle is just education, right, and just being connected to those opportunities, that seems like something we can do, right? That seems like something we can actually be helpful in, is being a connector and a conduit. And especially if kind of lack of trust was one of the big things, is let's go government light. We definitely want to partner with government and create a pipeline for government to see this pool of folks that they can more target, that they can target more and kind of reach effectively. But let's also not overly rely on that, right? So having the CDC be that partner, along with the CDFI enterprise, right, I think is a really great partnership. And then even talking with the CDFIs, we've talked to enterprise and others actually about financial products that they could offer this market, right? So if we're talking about wealth building and stuff opportunities, there's access to capital that they potentially just don't have right now. And one of the use cases for that we're really excited about actually is adding value to the property through adding a floor, building an ADU. ADUs are very popular in California right now. So ways to capture value without increasing rents necessarily too, right? So I think that that's those opportunities are on the table, which is exciting.
That's great. And I mean, so many great themes that I'm hoping we'll get around to later. But now we're going to turn to the city of Chicago. Brian, the city has been such a leader on creative strategies to preserve NOAA, a lot of different approaches. Ruby just described a very specific neighborhood in her presentation. And it's a neighborhood that's both sort of historically disinvested, but also near areas that are seeing increasing values and rents. Tell us about what Chicago is up to when it comes to preserving NOAA and what types of markets your programs target.
Cool, thank you. Thanks, Stacy. Thanks, Jack, the Preservation Compact, for having us. Ruby, thank you for sharing that story. And, in some ways, I look at it as, we have very similar markets to LA, but we have a lot of markets, and our neighborhoods are very different. And so we look at our neighborhoods along that lens. If we were to bucket them generically using our larger multifamily lens, we think of it as opportunity areas transitioning and then redevelopment or disinvested. And our NOAA programs need to be responsive to each, right? And in some sense, there's always that challenge of how do we hold on to affordability when the market is taking it away? And in other areas, we have the challenge of how do we actually ensure that a market exists and you're preserving and protecting. And so our tools are generally responsive in that lane, right? And I hear and appreciate the idea of government light. I think of it as reducing the barriers, because our NOAA audience, frankly, with majority or bulk of our housing being in NOAA, and a lot of that, half of that being in 2 to 4 unit buildings, are smaller owner operators, and our requirements for subsidy and compliance is a barrier. And often, depending on the regulations we have, you throw in additional barriers with wage regulations or requirements. And so I think about our programs really being responsive to the different markets. And so in some senses, we have programs that will work with collaboratively with local boots on the ground agencies to identify problem buildings and think about acquisition mechanisms. I think in other instances, we'll have programs that look at how do we refinance and help people preserve affordability long-term by bringing down some of those better operating costs. And then I think we look at the policy side of it. How do we bring in ADUs and anti-deconversion and inclusionary housing? And so it really is no single silver bullet, but a mixed approach that is kind of, keep your ear to the ground, work with your CDFIs and your nonprofits, and figure out how you can be a little bit more nimble.
Well, a perfect transition, Brian, to Jack Markowski, talking about working with CDFIs. So Jack, we've been discussing smaller owners here, and I know CIC works with a range of borrowers. Tell us about CIC's work, everything you do around preservation, and tell us a little bit about CIC's borrowers. You're on mute, Jack.
Thank you. So CIC, we call ourselves Chicago Multifamily Rehab Leader, and we are the leading lender in the Chicago area for naturally occurring affordable housing. We specialize in multifamily housing, which we classify as 5 units and above. It's primarily 5 to 49 units, or you might say 5 to 100 units. I think it's a little bit denser scale than what Ruby was talking about. So a typical CIC building might have maybe 20 units in it. And they are located, almost all of them, as people have said, 70 to 80% of all of our the affordable housing in Chicago is typically located in low and moderate income communities, primarily communities of color. CIC, we see the loss of this housing primarily is potentially comes about because of deterioration and disinvestment and loss of units, not because of appreciation, gentrification, conversion to higher priced units. And our main role is to ensure that credit continues to be available in these communities. That's the main threat to the loss of the housing. So since 1984, as Stacy mentioned, we've done about $1.6 billion of loans in this housing niche. And we are consistently the leading lender in Chicago, as I said, the largest lender for this 5 to 49 unit acquisition rehab housing. The people who own this housing, it's almost all privately owned. It's not a lot of not-for-profits. It's not government financed. And they're just small business entrepreneurs. And it's kind of interesting. They're people who have major investments in communities, but they're often kind of invisible in that they don't necessarily even live in the same community. They are not owner occupants in general, by the way. 6 units and above is what I said. So that you wouldn't find owner occupants. They're more better understood as small business people, but you won't see them with their retail business on the business strip. They also might not live in the neighborhood, but they might own the vast majority of the infrastructure in the community, the housing stock. So they're kind of invisible, but they have major stakes in the community. The people, we've done surveys of our borrowers. More than half of them are minority or women-owned businesses. About at least half of them have this as a full-time job. It's not, but half of them are not. They're part-time. They might be teachers or plumbers or bankers or in the hospitality business. But a lot of people come into this as a side business, and then they try to develop it into a full-time business. So that's very typical. Half of our borrowers have no employees whatsoever, but about half of them have an average of 4 employees. They own an average of 35 units. So it's not like they own 1 6 flat. I mean, they might own 5 units, or they might own 100 units, but on average, they own about 35 units. And so that's the people who these independent entrepreneurs, and we see their success and developing their businesses as very important to maintaining the viability of the housing stock.
Great. It's a great description of those CIC borrowers as we turn to Steve Rich. Steve, you're just the type of NOAA owner that Jack was describing. Many of the issues that Ruby raised earlier about small owners echo discussions that we had. Steve was part of our preservation lab about NOAA. So he was part of all these discussions. How important it is to support local responsible owners, especially given the breadth of complex challenges that all owners face. So tell us about your business, the types of buildings you own, and the type of market where your buildings are located.
Thank you, Stacy. I appreciate that. Actually, yes, as you mentioned, the buildings that I own are on the south side of Chicago. We have about 150 unit portfolio, mainly from 13 to about 28 units. Exactly the areas like Ruby and Jack mentioned, predominantly African-American, lower income, workforce housing, I like to speak of about a lot of the time. As Jack mentioned, I was exactly that same person, full-time job, went into the properties aspect on the side and kind of made it a full-time position. But some of the resources that the owners echoed that they could use in the NOAA labs that we have would be just kind of a resource station, right? Like Ruby mentioned, a lot of these owners may be 30 units or below. And at that point, what I actually experienced myself was just the difference in the access of what's available to you, the price points, insurance, contractors, property management. So yes, if we could kind of set up a collaboration, I think that would definitely be something that would help a lot of owners from what we heard in the lab.
It's great. Very, very helpful perspective. So back to you, Ruby. Steve just mentioned collaboration coming from the Preservation Compact. I always appreciate efforts that are rooted in collaboration. Tell us about the different partners that are part of LROC, especially the community partners, and the value of cross collaboration as you develop the initiative.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think just a lot of what we do is rooted in collaboration. Actually, I think especially when you're dealing with such a complex issue like housing and homelessness, we all need to have something in, right? Everybody needs to bring their chips to the table, and everyone needs to be in, because it's just not going to work otherwise. So we've done a lot of work with multi-sector collaborations, public and private partnerships, similar to this. So for us from the beginning, it was, okay, who do we need to partner with? What are the stakeholders, right, to bring in a community voice, the public sector, the private sector, right? Kind of all of these different pieces. And the community partner, CRCD, was, I think, and is one of the most critical pieces and kind of the quarterback of this whole this whole project. And they were the ones actually that came up with the actual geographic boundaries, right? They like looked at South Central LA and talked about, okay, this is based, so we had our parcel tool and kind of the data-driven standpoint, but we also had the more qualitative, like, hey, look, I'm in the community every day, all day, right? Like, and I know that this is where you have the folks hardest hit. Plus, we also had a few local coalition owners. So there was a minority apartment association owner who actually tended to be more on the bigger side, and also a more organic kind of smaller coalition that had just popped up during COVID. And so it was talking through them too about like, yeah, we know so-and-so who's down the block, right? And like, we know who owns this stuff, because all that stuff is a little bit informal and anecdotal, right? This is kind of an informal economy in a way. And so it was just so critical. Then you have the trust of a local community partner to do that work, right? Like that's really what it comes down to in a lot of these things is trust. And that community partner has that, which is great. And one of the other interesting things is selecting CRCD. We did an RFP process, and didn't talk to as many other funders about this, but now everyone is coming out of the woodwork saying, oh, they're great, right? Like that is the folks to get on board. And the Roy and Patricia Disney Foundation joined us as well recently. So it's been incredible too, in terms of how you build the public and political will around an effort like this with that community participation and engagement.
That's great. And, I love that you're talking about kind of these informal groups of owners. I know, Jack, you really love seeing those small owners collaborating and really see that as a critical activity. So from your perspective, talk about the benefits of these smaller building owners getting together.
Sure. One of the things, I back up one step and say that when we make loans to these small entrepreneurs that own the buildings, the success of the loan and the success of the building is 100% determined by the quality of their property management. And I just want to emphasize that we can, you can make loans on the same street and there can be a success right next to a failure, and it's completely dependent on the quality of the individual who owns and operates the building. So we've had for a very long time, for 20 years, property management training is a key element that goes along with our loan. We offer training in the basics of property management, and then on special topics like how to conserve energy or how to reduce your property taxes, different kinds, and lately, how to access resources that are available to survive the pandemic. So all of those things we offer to people, and we do it in a class webinar format. But there's nothing as good as the informal owner associations, that there's a myriad of them that have arisen around the city, and we've helped a number of those get started. So there's the Southside Builders Association and the Greater Austin Developers and the Edgewater Uptown Builders and Rogers Park Builders, all these different builders groups and apartment building owner groups. These are these informal associations where the people get together, the building owners, and as I said, they're kind of invisible. They might not live in the community. They don't know each other. And so, but they do get together through this, and they exchange information and support each other. By getting together, and then in Chicago, there's an overall umbrella group called the Neighborhood Building Owners Association. But they can collect themselves together to organize the stakeholders. They can get representation with like political figures or with different people in the community. They can see each other and talk to each other about how they're doing. They can exchange information on, Ruby was mentioning things like, if you want to do collective buying on things like insurance, or on where's a good guy who can do my roof or my back porch, or did you know about, we need somebody to get this building over here that's available for sale that was deteriorating or something. But lots of information, and it's a forum too for them to get together. One of the final thing I'd say is a lot of people talk about mentorship and training. And I'm always thinking about, how do you train people? How do you bring them from point A to point B? And I think classroom and formalized training has its role. And I think that there's things but so much is gained by joining an association like this, and on a monthly basis, basically, there's a lot of rubbing shoulders and mentorships and informal mentorships that are going on there. And you find that out, you kind of learn by doing, and you learn from each other. And so I think that is the best ongoing training and role modeling and mentorships that I've seen.
That great. That's exactly what we were hoping to achieve is, should there be something else? It's really great to have these small groups so that the owners can learn from each other. Steve, I know you're part of a couple of those groups. What's been your experience? What's the value that you see?
I think to Jack's point, there's a tremendous amount of value that's added by going and attending these monthly meetings. I think that a lot of these groups here in Chicago have made a great effort at kind of shifting to a COVID friendly option. But I think that a lot of these owners would be would benefit greatly from having kind of what we spoke about earlier, like a one-stop shop resource center, and maybe that these building associations can be like the backbone or kind of the outline or something that we could start with to assist, because you can, as I mentioned earlier, you can grab a lot of value from being in these groups with your peers, from tax benefits or different best practices, and and best insurance providers, and all sorts of things that are kind of specific to your area. So
that's great. That's helpful. I've just got a couple of other questions, but I would just encourage our participants here, if you have questions, please, push the little Q&A at the bottom of your screen there, type in your question. We can either answer it in real time, typing an answer, or, we'll definitely get to at least a couple of questions here after we finish with the panelists. So please do think through some questions and type them in. So I'm going to go back to Brian at the City of Chicago. So speaking of resources, Steve is talking about the importance of having the resources in one place. I know the Department of Housing does tend, like most government agencies who do housing, focusing on owners who really specialize in LIHTC, low-income housing tax credits. In our lab discussions, we heard from the Resurrection Project, which is a local nonprofit CDC that typically works with LIHTC and is now moving to acquire NOAA without LIHTC. Their target market that they're working in is seeing increasing values, so he really sees the value of preserving NOAA. Would you like to see more nonprofits doing that kind of activity, Brian? What do you think of that kind of activity in terms of that NOAA space? And what are some resources the city has that really works to preserve affordability in those kinds of markets where the values are increasing?
Yeah, no, thanks for the question. And I think the TRP model, that example, is very similar to the example that Ruby's talking about, right? There is a race to preserve affordability. And when we can work with nonprofits and local community groups to have that long-term vested interest that we share in, we definitely want to embrace that. And I think a lot of our successful programs come from engaging and working with the nonprofit community. But equally, it's that same, I think of the small 1 to 4 unit owners as a similar type of ownership entity that we need to embrace and work with. And so as far as nonprofit in the space, I highly encourage it. But I also would like to suggest that nonprofits don't always have to play the role of owner developer. And that there's definitely a role in partnership, and there's a role in terms of bringing boots on the ground experience at wherever your level of expertise is. So in some sense, the nonprofit partner could really be helping with how do you deal with us? How do you deal with the municipality and the bureaucracy of it, and giving the technical assistance and resources and support. I think greatly about the landlord training that CIC provides. Out of all the landlord situations, it's the only landlord training I can think about. We're a pretty big city. So where's our nonprofit support to help the small business owners deal with the portfolio responsibilities that they have? But as far as programs, we think about those same lines. I mean, there's those policy switches that we can do to help people bring, additional density to their units, like ADUs, the accessory dwelling units, and particularly in areas of appreciation where we can unlock housing that didn't exist before as a great additional tool. But our bread and butter is not in speed. That's the unfortunate side. And so it's really, how do we deal with the refinance and the permanent financing programs? And I think there's a lot of examples that you can think about with PAIR, where you had partnership that really brought together an acquisition strategy that landed in a preservation strategy that was financed through the department. And that was all driven by boots on the ground, nonprofits working together with private owners and private ownership to get that done.
Great example.
Could I'd like to interject something about nonprofits and ownership, and maybe just add to this. It seems to me that, and this is nothing against nonprofits, but when I think about I talked about owner operators and owner managers, and I want to emphasize that the people that we lend to for most of our naturally occurring affordable housing, most of them are owner operators, and they manage their own housing. And I don't know what definite, you might use words like, somebody's used the word like scrappy or hands-on, or as describing them as managers. But I want to emphasize that a lot of these people do everything, and I say sometimes things that other people think of as expenses, they think of as income. In other words, they do their own administrative work, they do their own bookkeeping, they do their own landscaping, they do all this, the maintenance of the building. They're 24/7. They might even do a plumbing repair on Saturday night or something. And I'm not saying that's the best thing in the world, but I'm saying that's what an owner operator is doing. And a nonprofit, and maybe like Steve, for instance, I bet he doesn't like to do too much of that on Saturday nights, the plumbing repair, but he does it at the beginning, particularly. And as he gets bigger, maybe he gets to a stage where other people are doing that for him. And I want to say that nonprofits, as I said, again, nothing against it, but it is not hands-on owner operations. It is more, it's more along the lines of a corporate ownership. And I don't say that in a bad way, but I say what it means, you have other people doing the work. And I'm saying it's not the same kind of hands-on owner operations. And so from my opinion, is that nonprofits do better in what I'm going to say are easier to manage places, which is, in fact, they do a better job in areas that are rising in values and rents, and that maybe don't have so many economic challenges, except the challenges to keep rents affordable. And with a nonprofit mission, they can very well have that kind of a form of ownership and operation, but have third-party managers. And they're mainly there to make sure that maybe there's social services, like Brian said, and they keep the rents affordable. And I think that the hands-on entrepreneurs are much more efficient operators in the lower income areas.
Well, and go ahead, Ruby, go ahead.
I was just going to say one thing that makes me think of that's interesting in this Avail CRCD enterprise and owner thing that we're doing is Avail is a for-profit tech company, right? That helps DIY, it's DIY property management, right? So it kind of is specifically on these independent owners. And one of the learnings actually was how the nonprofits work with them, right? And like it's structured in a way that Avail is, has the relationship directly with, and they're a tool, right? They're not the solution, they're a tool, because tech is not always a solution. But it was a learning too, in terms of how nonprofits could leverage tools like that in support and service of owners. And so it's almost like rethinking some of these relationships in some ways. And then what is a direct to consumer, direct to market, right? Like Avail is a direct to owner platform, but now they're figuring out how to work with nonprofits to leverage, Brian, to your point, how do you work with government? That is a huge black hole, especially on the tech side, right? Of things in terms of procurement, how all that works. Like, how do they support ERAF, emergency rental assistance funds that are coming out now? So I think that it's an interesting opportunity right now in what's happening with the CARES Act dollars and all of this stuff that's going on to think specifically about, how to use certain relationships to help support different stakeholders.
That's great. A really interesting discussion about market types and ideas about nonprofits and collaboration with for-profits. We've got some great questions coming in. So I'm going to dive into a couple of these questions. One is, I think I'm going to give this to Brian. How do you weed out bad actors who are considered predatory landlords by the community? And I know we've got Jack suggested you mention the TBI program here.
So, I mean, I think that's it. There's always the challenge of the heavy hand. And what does that mean, right? So who's a bad actor and what does that imply? And I think, with everything, it's, well, what are the resources available on both ends of that spectrum? There's some people that just need help. And can we provide some offer of help? There's other people that, they're out of their realm. There needs to be a different level of assistance. And we have a really great program that's been running for a number of years that really is in partnership with CDFIs and nonprofits, CIC, NHS being two of the major ones, but departments of law, Department of Buildings, and ourselves housing. And how do we look at buildings and challenges, troubled buildings, on a case-by-case basis, because that's really the effort they deserve. And in that, the goal is really, how do you bring that building back to productive use? And I think as long as you stick to the goals, you can inherit some values with that and provide support as needed across the board.
That makes a lot of sense. So here's a question from Peter Tatian, who says, in Washington, D.C., the relationship between private property owners and tenants and their respective advocates can be confrontational. And I think this is a good one for you, Ruby, potentially, as you're thinking about your collaborative. How have you seen people move to a more productive relationship where collaboration and cooperation is possible?
Yeah, great question. And part of me is like, well, gonna get back to you on that, but because this was definitely something that came up a lot. And I think what's interesting is, especially in LA, but across the country, I think you're seeing this too, right? Is that folks are connecting the dots about how we're more similar than different. Owners, small owners and tenants are sliding down this socioeconomic ladder together right now in this. And so the more that you can do to support, in all of the above, kind of a both and, I think the better. And the kind of reframing of, owners are not in the business to evict, right? There are bad actors, don't get me wrong, but it is not their bread and butter to evict. And there's a fear, though, of losing that as a tool for sure, right? And I think that comes down to a lot of the tension, but a lot of this is based on fear. And so I think, not to sound so like psychoanalysis on this, but like, I do think part of the learnings that we want to do with this cohort too are around, okay, what are the actual issues that you're doing? So actually, mediation is one of the services offered. So if an owner is getting into a situation with a tenant that they're, that they don't want them, they do want to, potentially move to eviction, we're asking them to come to CRCD first, and that we would talk through a mediation. So even if in the worst case scenario, the tenant does leave, if we could avoid eviction, and having that stain on tenants' record, I think of that as a type of win, right? And then thinking also more of being a community steward, right? And a housing provider, similar to the way the nonprofits talk about themselves as housing provider. Like, yes, it's a business for these small owners, but also a lot of them talked about the pride they feel in providing housing for their community. A lot of them knew too that they were renting below market. It was really interesting. I think that was a fear that actually some of the academics especially had around, whoa, if you start like saying you're naturally below market, are we going to see rent hikes all of a sudden? And maybe, right, because we don't know necessarily, because that hasn't happened in large scale. But what's interesting is that most of these owners that we've talked to, they all knew they're renting below market, and they're fine with that. They're like, look, I just need to make mine. I need to get my cut, and then I'm willing to, go on a limb for someone. I come from this community, even if they don't live in the same neighborhood, they live in the same city, most likely, right? Or the county. And so they get it. And so they're like, look, if I can give you a break, I will. So I think that is the type of owner we're trying to extract more from and kind of identify. And kind of like what we said before, there's not a lot of data on this ownership. So I think even a segmentation of what does that typical owner look like, right? Like, do they tend to live in the same county or city? Are they more skewed in the owning, fewer apartments? Are they, is it something that's concentrated in communities of color? Like, I think one thing that's interesting in the Avail data is, they're a national platform. So they've done a bunch of surveys on their users, and their typical user has about 2 units. So it's in that universe that we're kind of focusing on anyway. African-American owners were twice as assuming it was twice as likely. They were more likely, I should double check the number. They were more willing to work with their tenants than white independent owners. And I'm not trying to demonize white owners here either. There are some great white owners too. But I think the more data that we can get around how do owners view themselves in this, How do they view their tenants? What are the actual pain points? And how do we just shed more light on this in a way that I think would benefit both owners and tenants?
It's a great response. Does anyone else want to respond to that? Again, we've got some other questions here. Okay. This is a question about legal residency requirement, I guess, in NOAA properties. Have you worked with programs that provide acquisition and redevelopment of a property occupied primarily by undocumented residents? This is a question from Michael Badakin. Go ahead, Jack.
Well, I don't have any experience in that. I mean, we don't probe into that. I don't know that, and we haven't targeted anything specifically at it. So I don't know if anybody else has.
I mean, to me, that is kind of an answer, which is I don't think there's anyone asking the tenants when you're making a loan about their status. So perhaps that's the answer right there. Here's a question from Rafael Leon. Most nonprofits rely on public capital subsidies to preserve affordable housing, and it will take some time for nonprofits to think about affordable housing without capital subsidies. How do you support that transition? That's a good question. That's a really good question.
Well, let me just say, our friend Raphael is the president of Chicago Metropolitan Housing Development Corporation, CMHDC. And they are notable as a nonprofit that basically buys and operates affordable housing in strong markets. And I'd say their primary model is buy the unit, buy the building, do some upgrading of it, and keep the rents affordable. And they're a not-for-profit, and that's their long-term mission. They do not have this. He's an example of they do not provide hands-on management themselves. They are the owners of the portfolio of, I don't know, between 500 and 1,000 units. And they maintain, I think the main claim to fame there is that they have very light touch subsidies. And when I say light touch subsidies, I mean in Chicago, at the rents that people charge, which is generally in the neighborhood of maybe $700 to $1,100 a month for the kind of housing we're talking about, the buildings are worth about in the order of about say 70,000 or so per unit. There's a variation in that. And we all know that to produce new units with tax credits, I mean, we're talking 400,000 and more per unit. So there's a tremendous value in using this existing stock, doing light repairs to it and preserving it. And you can do it with light subsidies. And I know that CMHDC does that all over the place. And that's a really good example of how a not-for-profit can play a role in stronger markets to maintain affordability.
That's great. So I'm just going to get to another couple of questions here. A question from Bill Odell regarding energy efficiency and climate. Are those some strategies to preserve NOAA as well?
100%. I'm sure Brian probably has some thoughts on this too, because a lot of that's a key way that we see partnering with government actually, because there's a lot of existing programs and pots of money that exist to help retrofit older buildings, right? Either to get up to code, to get up to energy standards. And again, what we heard is we don't know how to get access to that money. What string does it come attached with? Who do I talk to, right? So if we can also help be a conduit for helping to spend those dollars, I think that would be huge.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. I mean, we're talking about people have been trapped in their houses for a year now. Deferred maintenance has always been an issue. When you're living on the cusp of affordability, the fact that you have to choose between paying your heat and buying food is always a struggle. And so it's really how do we ensure people can reduce their operating costs, live in their homes, make sure their homes last as long as they should be lasting. And we always need support for that. And we rely on our nonprofits to really get us to those people. But that goes back to the technical assistance. I mean, what I love about the whole idea of NOAA is how do we get people aware of the resources that are available, both in training, but also in financial capacity to get them to be, good operators, because not everybody chose to be an owner or operator. Some people came through it through inheritance. Some people came through it by choice. And so it's, there's a certain level of how do we just help people be better that we can be better at doing.
When we started the Preservation Compact many years ago, we surveyed owners, and the two biggest threats to on the operating cost side to maintaining affordability were rising property taxes and rising energy costs. And so we were able to, through the Energy Savers Loan Program, this is on a multifamily level, we found that very modest investments of like only $2,500 a unit could save 25 to 30% on the energy bills. And we've been able to, it's interesting, we were able to do that as kind of a leading edge of a program that had philanthropic funding like the MacArthur Foundation behind it. But eventually it's been incorporated into our regular lending platform. And it's a lot of the utility company incentives now have institutionalized this. So you can do a lot of things to cut energy and maintain those costs. And we've made a lot of progress there.
Well, I think that might be a great note for us to end on. It's 4 o'clock, and sustainability and keeping properties energy efficient is as many things that we've discussed here on this call, kind of like a twofer, right? It helps to preserve these buildings that are unsubsidized and helps the environment. So lots of great themes came out today about preserving NOAA. We're so glad that you were all able to join us. And thank you so much to Ruby and Jack and Brian and Steve for being our great panelists today. We really appreciate your time and effort. It was a great discussion. Thank you so much.